Okay, let's unpack this. We have a powerful, comprehensive set of materials in front of us today. I mean, this is really the foundational building blocks of understanding the modern economy.
It is. It's the entire scope of advanced macroeconomics. We're talking about the field that tackles the truly massive questions of economic life.
And what's so interesting here is the sheer systematic structure we have. We aren't just, skimming random facts.
Not at all.
Yeah.
We have a complete, organized blueprint that takes us logically from the most basic definitions of scale to these really complex policy tools, and then finally to the volatile dynamics of global trade.
Exactly. Our mission here is pure shortcut acceleration. We're giving you the foundational knowledge you need to understand the headlines, the policy debates, and just the big picture of how nations function.
It's about walking away with an in-depth, structured understanding of key macroeconomic concepts, but without it feeling like you just read a textbook.
Which is immensely practical, whether you're trying to track inflation or you're trying to understand a government's budget deficit or just wondering why your local central bank is raising interest rates.
The mechanics we're covering today, from national income accounting all the way to aggregate supply and demand, they provide the analytical lens.
Yep.
We're just going to follow the core themes of this material, moving from theory to measurement to policy and then context.
All right, let's start right at the beginning then, defining the sandbox we're playing in. So, macroeconomics. In its simplest form, it's the study of the economy as a whole.
Right, we're moving beyond the individual consumer or the single firm, and we're looking at the aggregate system.
When we talk about macro, we mean things like the national unemployment rate, the total amount of income a country generates, and the general level of prices, these huge economy-wide phenomena.
And that holistic view is the defining feature. It's funny, we often forget that this concept is relatively modern, or at least its formal application is.
That's a good point.
I mean, while the term macro was first formally used by Ragnar Frisch in 1933, the roots of this way of thinking go much, much deeper.
Yeah, the history is a great reminder that people were thinking about the whole system long before they had the tools to, measure it accurately. The mercantilists back in the 16th and 17th centuries.
They were totally focused on national wealth and trade balances.
Yeah.
They viewed the nation as a single economic unit that was competing with other nations.
And then later you had the physiocrats in the 18th century charting the circulation of wealth among different classes with their tableau économique.
But the real shift, the revolution that made macroeconomics truly indispensable, was the Great Depression of 1929.
Of course.
Before then, mainstream economic thought, what we call classical economics, largely believed that the economy was self-correcting, that individual markets would always adjust prices and wages to get back to full employment.
And what the Great Depression showed was just a stunning, catastrophic failure of that self-correction mechanism.
A total failure. You had massive, widespread unemployment that just persisted for years. You might have individual markets that looked like they were in balance, but the entire system was clearly broken.
So John Maynard Keynes steps in.
He steps in and provides the theoretical framework to explain this systemic failure. He argued that widespread unemployment was caused by a deficiency in aggregate demand.
So not a problem with the demand for labor in one factory, but a problem with total demand for everything in the nation.
Exactly. He looked at total demand and total supply for the nation. And this shift was absolutely necessary to address these huge economy-wide problems.
Which leads us right to that core distinction, micro versus macro. Microeconomics is all about the individual units, your personal income, the price of gas, the output decision of a single company.
And the fundamental problem it's trying to tackle is price determination and the optimal allocation of resources.
Right. And its tools are the ones we all learned first, the simple demand and supply curves for one specific good.
But macro, on the other hand, it looks at the aggregates. National income, total investment, total consumption, the general price level. The central problem in macro is totally different. It's determining the level of income and employment for the entire nation.
So if micro uses price as its main determinant, macro uses income. But the most crucial conceptual difference, the one that makes studying aggregates so tricky, is the infamous fallacy of composition.
Ah, yes. This is the crux of that whole transition from classical to Keynesian thinking. Classical economists mistakenly applied microanalysis to macro problems. They just assumed that what is true for an individual must be true for the whole.
Can you give us an example of that fallacy in action?
The classic one is saving. For an individual, saving more money is usually a very wise thing to do. It improves your personal financial security. That's microeconomically sound.
Makes sense.
But if everyone in the nation suddenly decides to save dramatically more and spend less, that's an aggregate phenomenon, then aggregate demand collapses.
Businesses see their sales just drop off a cliff.
They stop investing, they lay off workers, and overall national income falls. The collective action of saving leads to an outcome, a recession that is detrimental to everyone, including the people who started saving in the first place.
So Keynes's whole approach, viewing the economy as a whole, it fundamentally rejected the idea that these micro laws just scaled up perfectly to the national level.
It forced us to develop completely new tools, aggregate demand and aggregate supply.
Okay, so once we have that framework, the next logical step is to establish the objectives. Macroeconomics isn't just descriptive, it's also prescriptive.
Right. It provides the tools to judge a country's performance and to formulate national economic policies. And our sources lay out 5 overarching objectives that pretty much every government strives to meet.
The first one, and you could argue it's the most emotionally charged, is full employment.
But, and the source materials really emphasize this, the Keynesian definition of full employment is very specific. It's not just about getting the unemployment rate to 0.
Which is impossible anyway because of things like frictional unemployment.
Exactly. It's an equilibrium state defined by 3 conditions. Reducing the real wage rate to a level consistent with full capacity, ensuring there's enough effective demand to actually buy all that output, and having an inelastic supply of output at that full employment level.
Meaning you just can't squeeze any more production out of the labor force without causing inflation.
Precisely. It's about matching labor supply and demand at the economy's optimal output potential.
Okay, second goal. Price stability. Everyone wants stable prices. Nobody likes the uncertainty of, rampant inflation or, even worse, deflation.
Oh, deflation's a nightmare. Falling prices just disincentivize all consumption and investment.
But achieving true stability is a deep policy challenge. I mean, which price level do you even try to stabilize? Wholesale, retail, a specific basket of consumer goods?
And on top of that, price stability can actively conflict with other goals, especially growth. For instance, if a developing country needs to import expensive machinery, but it mandates stable domestic prices,
then the profits of domestic producers get squeezed because their costs are rising, but their selling prices can't.
which can really slow down investment and growth. So price stability, in reality, needs to allow for gradual, manageable price increases over the long run to enable those necessary market adjustments.
The third goal is the one everyone wants: economic growth. This is measured by that sustained increase in real per capita income over a long period.
It signifies a rising standard of living through more goods and services being produced. But, and the sources remind us of this, policymakers always have to confront the costs of growth.
Right. Growth is not a free lunch.
Not at all. Resources are scarce, which means every investment in future growth, like building a new factory, comes with an opportunity costless consumption today. And critically, we're facing these mounting environmental costs: pollution, urbanization, congestion.
And the social tension that rapid industrialization often brings. A government that's focused only on the growth figures, while ignoring these externalities, is probably undermining its long-term welfare.
Definitely. The fourth objective, which is becoming more and more critical in our globalized world, is balance of payments equilibrium.
So, maintaining a stable balance in our international transactions, this is a huge goal for national economic health.
It is. With global trade growing exponentially, a nation needs foreign currency to pay for imports and to service its debts. While an ideal balance might be imports equaling exports, a country often finds itself aiming for a mild export surplus.
Especially if it has, say, inadequate foreign exchange reserves. It's just to build up that financial buffer against future shocks.
But there's tension there, too. If a country consistently runs a massive export surplus, it means it's producing way more than it consumes.
Its citizens are essentially exporting their output without getting equivalent goods back, which could imply a needlessly low current standard of living.
And eventually, other nations are probably going to retaliate with protectionist measures. It's an incredibly complex tightrope to walk.
And finally, we get to the fifth goal, which is fundamentally normative: fair income distribution.
This one is all about equity. It's about ensuring the gap between the rich and the poor doesn't widen to socially unacceptable levels.
And this is where government intervention is most overt and direct. It's achieved using instruments like progressive taxes, where the rate increases with income.
And social expenditures like unemployment benefits, welfare, and housing assistance. The underlying macroeconomic principle here is that economic welfare genuinely increases only when the real share of income of the poor increases, leading to tangible improvements in their living standards.
But you have to do it in a way that doesn't actively harm the productive capacity or investment incentives of the wealthy, because that would just shrink the total economic pie for everyone.
Exactly. The trade-offs between equity and efficiency are just constant here.
Okay, so once we define the goals, we obviously need a scorecard. How do we know if we're growing, or stable, or fully employed?
This brings us to national income accounting. It's the essential bookkeeping system a government uses to measure the scale and speed of its economic activity.
And this accounting system generates this whole stack of interrelated concepts that economists are tracking constantly. Gross domestic product, GDP, gross national product, GNP, net national product, NNP.
And the crucial difference between real and nominal figures. But the primary, most cited figure is always GDP.
So let's define gross domestic product, GDP, precisely. It is the market value of all final goods and services produced within a country's borders during a given period, usually a year.
And that definition, as simple as it sounds, is full of landmines for the casual analyst.
The first landmine is that phrase, final goods and services. This is entirely to solve that fundamental accounting challenge of double counting.
Right. Imagine a loaf of bread. If we count the wheat sold by the farmer, and then the flour sold by the miller, and then the final bread sold by the baker.
We've counted the value of the wheat 3 times.
You've got it. So you either count only the value of the final product, the bread, or you use this really ingenious workaround the sources provide. You count only the value added at each stage of production.
And value added is just the market value of a firm's output minus the cost of inputs it purchased from other firms.
Let's use a quick example. Imagine a lumberjack cuts down a tree and sells the wood for $100 to a sawmill. That's $100 of value added.
Okay.
The sawmill cuts the wood into lumber and sells it to a furniture maker for $250. The sawmill's value added is $150.
Right, the difference between what they sold it for and what they paid for the raw wood.
Exactly. Then the furniture maker builds a chair and sells it to a retailer for $500. Their value added is $250. And finally, the retailer sells it to you for $700, adding $200 of value.
So the final price is $700. And if you add up the value added at each stage, 100 plus 150 plus 250 plus 200, it also equals $700.
That's the same number. It's 2 ways of getting to the same correct measure of GDP contribution. It's a very rigorous system.
And what do we leave out? The course materials are very strict on this. We exclude goods and services that don't have a market value, unpaid housework, volunteer effort.
Because they aren't exchanged through the market system, we obviously exclude all intermediate goods. And we also exclude financial transactions that don't arise from current year production.
Like selling an old house or a used car.
Right. The value of that asset was counted in the year it was produced. The only thing counted in the current GDP year is the service provided, the real estate agent's commission, or the car dealer's margin.
Because that's value added in the current period. And finally, transfer payments are out because they're just shifting existing purchasing power around, not paying for new production.
Now for the classic distinction, GDP versus GNP. GDP uses geographical boundaries, output produced within the country's borders.
GNP uses nationality, output produced by the country's nationals, regardless of where they are physically located.
This is really critical for countries with a lot of international labor flow or global companies. If a foreign-owned factory produces cars inside your country, that output is in your GDP.
But if your citizens earn income working abroad, that income is counted in your GNP, but not your GDP.
The relationship is simple. Gross national product, GNP, equals gross domestic product, GDP, plus what's called net factor income from abroad.
The final essential pair is nominal versus real. Nominal GDP is the value measured using current market prices.
Which means if inflation is 10%, your nominal GDP can increase by 10% without any actual increase in production.
Which makes nominal GDP completely useless for measuring actual growth over time.
Totally useless. That's why we need real GDP. This is just nominal GDP adjusted for inflation using the prices from a designated base year. Real GDP is the measure that accurately reflects the physical volume of goods and services produced.
So if you produce 10 apples this year at $1 each, your nominal GDP is $10. If next year you produce the same 10 apples, but they cost $2 each, your nominal GDP is $20.
But your real GDP, if the base year price was $1, is still $10. It's that constant dollar figure that tells you the truth about what's really happening with economic activity.
And the importance of these measures, I mean, it can't be overstated. They're like the annual income statement for a nation.
They allow for analysis of distribution, expenditure, forecasting, and crucially, international comparisons to judge a country's economic size and performance relative to others.
So how is that total GDP figure actually calculated? The most common way is by tallying up who is doing the spending. This is the expenditure approach, famously summarized by that equation, y equals c plus I plus g plus xn.
Right, where Y is the total national output or income. Let's break down the components of that spending, starting with C, personal consumption expenditure.
This is the largest component in most developed economies. It includes all actual and imputed expenditures by households.
And consumption is broadly categorized into three types: durable goods, like washing machines or cars,
Non-durable goods like food, clothes, or gas.
and services, which is the fastest growing category: healthcare, education, legal advice.
Okay, next up is I, gross private domestic investment. This is maybe the most misunderstood term. When economists say investment, they don't mean buying stocks or bonds.
Not at all. They mean spending by firms on final goods that are used to produce future goods. The three main components are non-residential investment, so new factories, machinery, tools,
Residential investment, which is buying or building new homes or structures to be rented out.
and the change in inventories, which is goods that have been produced but are kept in storage to be sold later.
And the word gross in gross investment is another important qualifier. It means this figure includes the capital that was spent just to replace worn out, depreciated capital.
Right. If you were to subtract that depreciation, you'd get net investment.
Then we have G, government consumption, and gross investment. This covers all spending by federal, state, and local governments on final goods and services, paying teachers' salaries, buying new military equipment, constructing roads.
And the crucial exclusionary rule here, and this is one that trips up a lot of beginners, is that transfer payments are excluded from G.
Why is that?
Because transfers like Social Security checks, unemployment benefits, or interest paid on government debt are simply income redistribution. They don't represent the production of a new good or service in the current period.
So the money gets counted later when the recipient spends it as part of C or I.
Exactly. And finally, we deal with the external economy, XN, debt exports. This is just the difference between exports, X, goods sold abroad, and imports, M, goods purchased from abroad.
So if X is bigger than M, you have a trade surplus, which adds to domestic demand. If M is bigger than X, you have a trade deficit, which subtracts from domestic demand.
And the reason we have to include net exports is purely for accurate accounting of domestic production. When we tally up C, I, and G, we inevitably include spending on imported goods. We have to subtract those imports because they weren't produced here.
And conversely, we have to add the exports because they were produced here but were consumed by foreigners.
Net exports just adjust the total to reflect only what was produced within our borders.
Now, before we move on, it's really vital to circle back to the philosophical question that the material raises: GDP and its relation to economic welfare.
Yes, A.C. Pigou correctly defined economic welfare as the part of social welfare that can be measured in money. But we have to be honest. GNP or GDP is not a satisfactory measure of true welfare.
It's the classic criticism, right? It measures output, but not happiness or quality of life. The sources point out that welfare can actually decline even if GDP rises significantly.
Absolutely. This happens when the growth is purely inflationary. Real GDP hasn't actually increased, but nominal GDP has. Or, during a major war, production shifts disproportionately to military goods, leaving consumers with fewer actual goods and a lower standard of living despite high production numbers.
Or, and this is the most critical one, if all the growth just goes to the top 1%, if income inequality widens dramatically.
So the measurement is only truly meaningful if it translates into improved living standards, specifically for those at the bottom. Welfare increases when the real share of the poor increases, improving their conditions, without simultaneously harming the productive capacity that generates the overall wealth. It's a measure of quantity, not quality. So we've talked about how to measure the economy. Now we have to talk about the lubricant that makes the entire system possible: money.
And the only way to really appreciate the genius of money is to first remember the nightmare it replaced: the barter system.
The barter system was just fundamentally inefficient. Its central flaw was the double coincidence of want. I have to find someone who not only has what I want, but also wants what I have.
Right. If I have corn and I need a cow, I need to find a cow owner who happens to need corn right now. The search cost is immense.
And that wasn't the only flaw. I mean, imagine trying to trade a live goat for a handful of yams. You face the problem of divisibility. How do you split a goat without killing it and losing its value?
You've got storability, most commodities spoil, and the system was just cumbersome. You couldn't carry your wealth around easily.
Money solved all of these problems. Historically, it evolved from commodity money, like the shekel in Mesopotamia or cowrie shells, which had its own intrinsic value.
To representative money, which was basically paper receipts that were redeemable for gold or silver.
And finally, we arrived at fiat money. This is money whose value isn't backed by a physical commodity, but is simply declared by the government to be legal tender.
Post-1971, the US dollar and most global currencies became fiat money, which requires a huge amount of public faith and government management.
For fiat money to work, it has to have 6 key characteristics. The most important is acceptability. Everyone has to trust it. It has to be homogeneous or uniform. It must be relatively stable in value.
And it has to be divisible, portable, and finally, its supply must be relatively scarce and regulated by the government. If everyone can print it, it's worthless.
Those characteristics allow money to perform 4 vital functions. First, the most obvious one, medium of exchange, which eliminates the inefficiency of barter. Second, store of value, a convenient way to hold wealth.
Third, unit of account, which standardizes values and makes the entire price system possible, so you can compare the value of a car to the value of a washing machine.
And fourth, a critical function for modern finance, standard of deferred payments. This means money makes lending, borrowing, and the creation of future contracts possible.
If I lend you money today, I expect to be repaid in money of a predictable value in the future.
And speaking of Keynes again, he analyzed why people choose to hold money to hold liquid cash rather than putting it all into assets that generate returns. He identified 3 distinct motives for this.
The first is the simple, obvious one, the transactionary motive. You need cash or a liquid bank balance for your day-to-day purchases, groceries, rent, bills.
And this is usually proportional to your income. Second, you have the precautionary motive. This is liquid money you keep aside for unforeseen emergencies or contingencies. It's your emergency fund.
It's a hedge against uncertainty.
Exactly. The third motive is where the demand for money becomes elastic or responsive to interest rates. The speculative motive. This involves holding cash specifically to take advantage of expected changes in bond and security prices.
Let's unpack that because it's a bit counterintuitive.
It is. Bond prices and interest rates move inversely. So if I hold cash today, it's because I believe bond prices are going to fall tomorrow, which means interest rates are going to rise.
By waiting, I can buy the bonds cheaper tomorrow, locking in a higher rate of return.
Precisely. And if I expect bond prices to rise, meaning interest rates will fall, I buy the bonds today, which means my demand for cash falls. This is why the demand for money, for speculative purposes, is negatively related to the interest rate.
The institutions that manage this complex flow of money are the financial intermediaries, primarily banks, which accept deposits and channel that stored value into productive lending.
And the course materials give a fascinating look at the development of the Nigerian banking system, which really shows the typical evolution of finance in a developing economy.
It's a great case study in institutional growth. It started simply in 1892 with the African Banking Corporation.
But the initial regulatory structure, like the West African Currency Board from 1912, often hindered local development. It mandated that currency reserves had to be invested abroad, which starved the local economy of capital.
It took decades for local control and standardization to emerge. We see the first banking legislation in 1952, which began setting standards and requiring reserves.
The critical leap was in 1959, when the Central Bank of Nigeria, CBN, began operations, issued its own currency, and started asserting control.
And a key historical detail, especially for governance students, is that shift in 1968. A military decree substantially reduced the CBN's statutory independence, transferring ultimate authority over policy to the Federal Executive Council.
And this institutional tension between central bank independence and political control is a theme we see globally.
Within the sector, we have 2 major types of banks. Commercial banks are the most common. They are focused on profit.
Their primary functions are accepting various deposits and advancing loans. They are the engine of retail finance.
Then you have merchant banks, often called the wholesale bankers. They don't typically deal with small consumer accounts. They cater to corporate customers.
Their expertise is in medium and long-term finance, project financing, equipment leasing, and complex loan syndication. They build the big deals.
And at the apex of this entire system is the central bank, the regulator. Historically, central banks often emerged from necessity, like the Bank of England, founded in 1694, primarily to finance the government's wars.
A central bank has three traditional functions that form its core mandate. First, managing the entire monetary system, regulating the overall supply and cost of credit.
Second, serving as the banker to the commercial banks. It holds their legal reserves and, crucially, acts as the lender of last resort to prevent a systemic collapse.
Right. And it operates the clearing system for checks and payments. Third, it acts as the financial agent for the national government. It manages the government's accounts, issues its debt, and advises on financial policy.
However, the source material correctly emphasizes the developmental role of the central bank, particularly in developing countries.
Yes. Where financial markets are rudimentary, the central bank often has to actively nurture and build the financial structure, encouraging the growth of institutions and capital markets that might not naturally emerge quickly enough on their own.
Which brings us to that perpetual tension, the relationship between the central bank and the government. Should it be totally independent, or should it be under direct political control?
The material advises a difficult middle ground. Total independence is often seen as undesirable because monetary policy is intrinsically part of overall economic policy, which must ultimately be accountable to the people through the elected government.
But the flip side is equally dangerous. If the central bank is just an arm of the government, it can get buried in bureaucracy and lose the credibility it needs to deal with global markets and maintain public confidence in the currency.
Therefore, the preferred model is relative independence in the execution of policy free from short-term political manipulation, while the government retains ultimate responsibility for the broader economic direction. That balance is fundamental to modern macro governance.
Now we take the goals, the measures, and the money, and we put them into the foundational analytical tool of macroeconomics, the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model.
This is how we link prices and output. So aggregate demand, AD, as we've established, is the total demand for all goods and services in the economy.
Y equals C plus I plus G plus XN. Graphically, the AD curve shows that negative relationship between the general price level and short-run equilibrium output.
And the first aha moment for any student is realizing this is not a simple micro-demand curve. In micro, if the price of apples falls, consumers buy more apples because they're relatively cheaper than bananas.
But in macro, if the general price level falls, all prices, wages, input costs, other final goods are also falling or expected to fall.
So the downward slope of the AD curve is driven by four powerful mechanisms that link price changes to the components of expenditure.
Let's walk through those drivers. First, the monetary authority response. If inflation is rising rapidly, what's the central bank's typical reaction?
They raise the interest rate. Higher interest rates increase the cost of borrowing for firms and consumers. This directly suppresses investment and dampens consumption.
So high prices lead to high rates, which reduce total spending. The AD curve slopes down.
Second, the effectiveness of money supply. Suppose the central bank keeps the physical money supply constant. If the price level rises, people need more cash to conduct the same number of transactions.
This increased demand for money forces the interest rate up, assuming supply is fixed.
And again, rising interest rates reduce C&I, causing output to decrease. It's a powerful internal mechanism.
Third, we have the real wealth effect. Imagine you have a significant cash savings account. If the price level suddenly doubles, what happens to the real value of your savings?
The real purchasing power is cut in half. You feel poorer. And when households feel poor, they reduce their consumption. This reduction in C leads directly to lower aggregate output.
And finally, the global connection. The foreign price of domestic goods effect. Assuming the exchange rate stays constant, if our domestic price level rises, our goods suddenly become much more expensive relative to foreign goods.
This makes our goods less attractive abroad, causing exports to fall. Conversely, imports become relatively cheaper for us, so imports rise. The result is a drop in net exports.
And since net exports is a component of AD, the AD curve shifts downward in response to higher prices. All four effects contribute to that negative relationship. All right, now for the supply side. Aggregate supply, AS, is the total output, or real GDP, that firms plan to sell at a given price level.
And like AD, the AS curve is complex. It's defined as a price-output response curve. And it is explicitly not the simple sum of individual supply curves because many large firms are price setters, not price takers.
Let's first look at the short-run as S-curve. This is the curve relevant to current policy decisions, and it's upward sloping, showing that in the short run, higher prices lead to higher output.
But its shape is not uniform, and that shape is incredibly informative about the state of the economy. At very low levels of output, when the economy is in a deep recession, the curve is relatively flat
Why is that?
because firms are operating way below capacity. They have unemployed labor and idle capital. If demand increases, they can respond mainly by increasing output with very little price increase because their marginal costs are small.
They can hire unemployed workers without needing to drastically increase wages.
Exactly. But as output expands and the economy approaches full capacity, the curve becomes dramatically steeper until it's nearly vertical. This is the crunch point.
Because now firms are hitting their capacity constraints, the physical limit of their factories, the scarcity of skilled labor.
Any further increase in demand cannot be met by increased output. The only thing that happens is that firms bid up the prices of scarce resources and the general price level just rises.
Which leads us directly to the long-run AS curve. This curve is defined by the economy's potential output, and it is perfectly vertical.
And the vertical nature is one of the most fundamental ideas in macroeconomics. The long run is defined as the time needed for all input prices, particularly wages, to fully adjust to changes in output prices.
So if the price of everything you sell increases by 10%, and eventually the wages you pay and the cost of your raw materials also increase by 10%,
Your profit-maximizing level of output remains exactly the same. Output in the long run is fixed, determined only by technology and resource availability, not by the price level.
and the dynamic interaction between AD and AS is what determines the short-run equilibrium, the current level of national output and the general price level. And policymakers are constantly trying to shift these curves to achieve their goals.
Let's start with an expansionary shift in AD. This might be triggered by the government cutting taxes or increasing spending, or the central bank cutting interest rates. The AD curve shifts to the right.
In the short run, the immediate result is that output increases and the price level increases. This is a boom period. Unemployment falls, but inflation starts to pick up.
Right. The economy is operating above its long-run potential. But this disequilibrium cannot last. In the long-run adjustment, because the economy is overheating, workers demand higher wages and input costs rise.
So that causes the short-run AS curve to shift left or upwards. The adjustment continues until output falls back to the potential long-run level.
But the price level has permanently increased even further. The growth was temporary, the inflation is permanent.
Conversely, let's look at a contractionary shift in AD, maybe from a central bank aggressively raising interest rates to fight inflation.
In a short run, output decreases and the price level decreases. This is a recessionary gap, high unemployment, slow growth. The economy is operating below potential.
The long-run healing mechanism then kicks in. Because of high unemployment, workers eventually accept lower wage increases, and firms can negotiate lower input costs.
This reduction in costs shifts the short-run AS curve to the right, or downwards. Output eventually recovers back to the potential long-run level, and the price level decreases further. The market attempts to self-correct, though this process can take years.
And finally, we have to consider supply shocks, which are often external and far more painful for policymakers.
Oh, much more painful. Take an adverse supply shock like a sudden spike in global oil prices. This immediately raises the cost of production for nearly every firm in the economy.
Which means the short-run AS curve shifts sharply to the left. The immediate short-run result is devastating. Output decreases and the price level increases.
We get less output and higher prices at the same time. The sources correctly label this phenomenon as stagflation.
And stagflation presents a terrible dilemma for the government. If they use expansionary policy to restore output, they make inflation even worse.
And if they use contractionary policy to fight the inflation, they drive the economy deeper into recession. It's a no-win situation in the short run.
We shift our focus now to Module 6, which analyzes the government's direct levers. Fiscal policy. We start with government spending, G, which includes all expenditures on essential services like defense, roads, education, and so on.
Right. And again, always excluding transfer payments.
Yeah.
The historical trend globally has been a persistent increase in the scope and scale of government spending. And this isn't accidental. The material points to several systemic drivers.
The first is defense needs and internal security. Those demand massive capital and recurrent expenditure. Second, population growth requires more amenities, more schools, more hospitals, more roads, all paid for by the government.
Third, national development projects are often very capital intensive, like building airports or refineries. Fourth, currency depreciation raises the domestic cost of imported goods and services the government needs to buy.
And fifth, and this is increasingly critical, is the mandatory expense of interest on public debt. As national debt grows, the cost of servicing that debt becomes a huge part of the budget, often crowding out more productive spending.
To finance all this spending, governments use four main sources. The most significant, of course, is taxation.
Second, the government collects rents, royalties, and profits from state-owned enterprises or rights granted for mining. Third, revenue comes from smaller sources like fines, fees, and special charges.
And finally, governments rely heavily on loans. These can be short-term via treasury bills, medium or long-term via public bonds, or external loans from institutions like the IMF and World Bank.
Let's spend a bit more time on taxation, the primary source of revenue. Its purpose goes far beyond just, filling government coffers.
It does. The material lists 6 crucial roles for taxes, which really show their power as a policy tool. While revenue generation is number one, taxes are also vital for redistributing income, using progressive tax systems to narrow the gap between rich and poor.
Taxes are also used to control the economy. By adjusting tax rates, the government can regulate inflation or fight deflation. They can also modify the influence of the price system, for instance, by using protective tariffs to shield infant domestic industries.
Furthermore, taxes are used to discourage undesirable consumption. Those heavy levies on products like alcohol and cigarettes, often called sin taxes. And finally, they're used to promote economic growth by offering things like tax holidays or investment allowances to incentivize certain activities.
Now for the taxonomy of taxes. Direct versus indirect. Direct taxes are levied on income or profits, and the incidence, or the ultimate burden, falls directly on the person or firm paying the government.
Right. Examples include personal income tax, corporate tax, property tax. They exist in 3 main forms. Progressive, where the rate increases as income increases.
Regressive, where the rate decreases as income increases.
And proportional, where it's just a constant rate.
The advantages of direct taxes are their high yield, their certainty, and their powerful income redistribution effect. But the disadvantages are equally significant.
They can be disincentive to work or invest, they incentivize tax avoidance, and they can repel foreign capital if the rates are too high.
Conversely, indirect taxes are levied on goods and services. They're collected through an intermediary, the retailer or manufacturer, but the burden is shifted to the final consumer.
Examples are customs duties and excise duties. These are convenient, they provide certain and immediate revenue, and they can act as an automatic economic stabilizer.
The chief disadvantage, though, is that indirect taxes are often regressive. A consumption tax on a necessity like fuel is paid equally by the poor and the rich, so it takes a much larger percentage of the poor person's income.
And they can be inflationary if firms just pass the full cost increase on to consumers.
And before we move on, there's a crucial semantic distinction for you to remember: tax evasion versus tax avoidance.
Yes, evasion is the deliberate refusal to pay tax that is legally owed. It's a criminal act. Avoidance is exploiting legal loopholes to pay less tax. It's often legally gray, but it's not criminal.
And governments are constantly working to close those avoidance loopholes while prosecuting evasion.
The budget is the ultimate fiscal document. It's the annual projection of spending decisions versus projected revenue and financing sources. It's a window into a government's economic priorities.
And the budget structure uses 4 key accounting concepts. Recurrent expenditure covers the running costs, wages, maintenance, debt interest. Recurrent revenue comes from taxes, fines, and fees.
Then you have capital expenditure, which is spending on long-term capital projects like roads or hospitals. And finally, capital receipts, which are primarily loans, foreign aid, and grants used to finance those capital projects.
Analyzing the relationship between expenditure and revenue gives us the 3 typical budget outcomes. The rare sight is a budget surplus where revenue exceeds total expenditures.
That surplus can be used to pay off accumulated debt or build financial savings. The most common outcome is the budget deficit, where expenditures are greater than income.
And the accrued deficits are what form the national debt. A deficit is primarily financed by borrowing.
Deficits aren't inherently evil, but they have to be managed. You can counter them by promoting economic growth, reducing spending, or increasing taxes.
And the simple ideal is the balanced budget, where revenues equal or exceed expenses. Regardless of the outcome, in a functioning democracy, the government can't spend money without the explicit approval of the legislature, which acts as a check on fiscal power.
We finalize our deep dive by putting the national economy into the global context, the open economy. An open economy is defined by its economic activities with the outside world.
Right, trade in goods and services and the flow of investment. But why do countries even do this? Why not just be totally self-sufficient? The reasons are rooted in survival and growth.
First, imports serve essential needs. Raw materials and specialized machinery for domestic industry, and for consumers, they just massively enlarge choice and variety.
Second, exports are absolutely vital. They provide domestic producers with a market that is much larger than the domestic one.
And crucially, exports are the primary way a nation earns the foreign exchange it needs to pay for necessary imports and service its international debt.
Plus, exports act as a potent agent of growth. Selling abroad stimulates production, increases investment, and acts as a catalyst for total national spending, which in turn boosts GNP.
You really cannot achieve modern development without engaging in international trade.
The question then becomes, what should a country produce and trade? The earliest answer came from Adam Smith with the theory of absolute advantage.
This theory states that a country should specialize in and export the good it can produce more efficiently, getting more output with the same resources than its trading partner.
Simple specialization based on superior productivity.
But what if one country is simply better at producing everything? David Ricardo provided the critical theoretical breakthrough with the theory of comparative cost advantage.
The basis of trade is not absolute advantage, but comparative advantage, the lower opportunity cost of production.
This is a beautiful, counterintuitive insight. A country should specialize and export goods where its opportunity cost is lowest and import goods where its opportunity cost is highest, even if it has an absolute advantage in both.
It means sacrificing the least valuable output to gain the most valuable import.
Let's use the classical example from the sources. England and Portugal producing wine and cloth. Suppose Portugal uses 80 labor hours for 1 unit of wine and 90 hours for 1 unit of cloth. England uses 120 for wine and 100 for cloth.
So Portugal is absolutely better at producing both.
Yes. But look at the opportunity cost. For Portugal, to get 1 unit of wine, they must give up 0.89 units of cloth. For England to get 1 unit of wine, they must give up 1.2 units of cloth.
So Portugal's opportunity cost for wine is lower than England's. Portugal specializes in wine.
But consequently, England's opportunity cost for cloth is lower than Portugal's. England specializes in cloth. By specializing according to this comparative cost, both nations maximize their total output and benefit from trade.
The ultimate result of this is the gain from trade. When both countries specialize, the total world output of both goods increases.
Right. And the question then is how those gains are distributed. That's determined by the terms of trade, TOT, the ratio of a country's export prices to its import prices.
If your export prices rise relative to your import prices, your terms of trade improve, and you gain more from the exchange.
And the acceptable range for the TOT is fascinatingly constrained. It has to lie between the domestic opportunity costs of the two trading partners before trade. The final price settles somewhere in that range.
Finally, we have to integrate international trade back into our core model via the net export function, NX. This is how the global market influences aggregate demand.
We treat exports X as largely exogenous. They're determined by factors outside our immediate control, like the income levels and tastes of foreign consumers.
But imports, however, have a critical relationship with our own domestic economy. Imports have a fixed component and a variable component that increases directly and positively with our domestic income.
So as the country gets richer, it buys more imported goods. Since exports are fixed, but imports increase as our national income increases, the net export balance is negatively related to national income output.
A domestic boom often leads to a trade deficit.
And this entire relationship is critically sensitive to international prices and the exchange rate. The exchange rate is just the price of our domestic currency in terms of foreign currency.
Let's track the impact. If our domestic currency appreciates or becomes stronger, our exports become more expensive for foreigners, and imports become cheaper for us.
So exports fall, imports rise, and net exports falls, shifting the AD curve downwards.
Conversely, if the currency depreciates or becomes weaker, our exports are cheaper abroad and imports are more expensive at home.
Exports rise, imports fall, and net exports rises, shifting the AD curve upwards. This is a powerful policy tool for managing trade balances.
Ultimately, the equilibrium in the open economy is still where AD equals C plus I plus G plus NX. A positive net export balance adds strength to AD, which can pull an economy out of a recession.
And a persistent negative net export deficit subtracts demand, acting as a drag that can worsen or prolong a recession.
We just completed an intensive review of macroeconomics, moving through the entire course structure. We established the framework by contrasting micro and macro, highlighting the fallacy of composition, and detailing the 5 ambitious goals of macro policy.
We then provided the tools for measurement, how to rigorously calculate GDP and GNP, the critical difference between nominal and real figures, and why GDP alone is an insufficient measure of true economic welfare.
We analyzed the monetary engine, from the failures of barter to the Keynesian motives for holding cash and the critical role of the central bank.
And we brought it all together with the ADAS model, explaining the mechanisms that drive the downward slope of AD and the shape of the AS curve, walking through those complex short-run and long-run adjustments from both demand and supply shocks.
Finally, we linked fiscal policy, taxation, deficits, government spending to the global context of the open economy, using Ricardo's theory of comparative advantage to explain why we trade, and the net export function to explain the resulting macroeconomic impact.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, you now have the conceptual scaffolding to analyze any major economic event. When you read about stagflation, you immediately picture that adverse supply shock. When a central bank debates independence, you understand the tension between political accountability and monetary prestige.
This is the application, the power of prediction and understanding, and it raises an important question for you to mull over.
Given the inherent tension between those 5 major goals of macroeconomics, full employment, price stability, economic growth, balance of payments, equilibrium, and fair income distribution, which of these goals, particularly in a developing economy aiming for rapid industrialization, do policymakers always have to compromise on first?
And why is that compromise so often necessary for long-term growth?
Think about the difficult policy trade-offs required to transition a low-income economy into a stable high-income one. The choice of which goal has to be temporarily sidelined often defines the success or failure of a government's entire economic agenda.
We hope this deep dive has given you the foundational knowledge to analyze those massive decisions. We wish you success in your future analyses, and we hope you found this material illuminating and highly practical.